Hey everyone, I'm Rather Incoherent, and these are the Composures of Arkham Horror. They're cards that I generally don't play with, and I wanted to take a second to look at all of them and really try to hammer out what I think of them and why it is that I don't play them very much. Now, generally, I can very concisely say why I don't play the level 1 versions. They're 1 experience, 1 cost cards in my deck that do literally nothing unless I pump more money into them. And generally speaking, outside of big money green, I don't have money to afford on that effect. It's a nice to have, but if I had just put a different card with that experience in my deck, it would likely have had better results than taxing my economy by doing this. This complaint is universal for every single one of the 1 experience composures. All of them do nothing except to die when you take unsoaked damage, and then you have to spend resources on them to get any value out of them. In my eyes, that just makes them weak to the point of being borderline unplayable unless you have some very specific card combination or investigator interaction happening. So in this video, I feel like I can concisely say why I don't play any of the level 1 composures. And I don't really feel the need to talk about them anymore because the level 3 composures are the ones that are actually worth playing. The ones where I'm afraid that maybe the reason I don't play them is out of bias towards the old bad ones. Because the level 3 ones are inherently much, much better. Instead of costing you a resource, now they're free. They're still fast, but now they have enough soak that as long as you can soak the other type of damage, you can actually keep them protected much more easily. You don't have to have infinite soak for both types of damage to protect them. And just having the bonus be passive with the ability to spend resources on it if you desperately need it is much better. Because now the allure of the card is you get +1 fist and +1 foot in the case of combat training, and then you can spend resources to get even more. That's much better than if you draw this card and spend the resource to play it, then you can spend more resources to get the bonus. Flat bonus is tremendously better. And the fact that I view that lightning bolt ability as a nice to have makes it very clear why I don't like the level 1 versions. The entire allure of the card is something that I view as a bells and whistle effect on the level 3 version. And with combat training, almost all of the blue fighters could care about this card quite a lot. With the exception of Mark, none of them have 5 fist, so they all appreciate the fists, and most of them have bad foot. So they're going to appreciate the foot some of the time, and a lot of the time they're going to be willing to spend some of their money, even though it'll suck for a Guardian, on that additional foot to pass a test. I could mention that it plays really nicely with well-connected, or not well-connected, well-prepared, but I don't think playing nicely with the suboptimal card is a meaningful reason to consider a card. If you're already playing gimmicky, well-prepared decks, though, then combat training is inherently much, much better in those decks. I don't view it as a bonus of combat training, but it is a reason to consider it more once you're already going for that deck. Guardians tend to have the best soak in the game. Their healing doesn't help them protect this directly, but they can use things like Hallow to Mirror to heal up the horror on their assets, keep their brother Xavier's and beat comps and guard dogs going longer. So if you are playing like a high ally blue deck, which is a very reasonable thing to be doing, combat training actually helps a lot. The fact that it costs 0 decreases the cost of your deck. You might not want to spend the resources on the bottom of this, but getting the fist and the foot can be helpful in a lot of situations. The main reason I don't see combat training happening very often, though, is because it's a blue 3 experience card. Sneakers will have a very similar problem when we get to them, but Guardians have a lot of borderline mandatory experience. If you're trying to optimize decks, it's really hard to make a case for a Guardian who's doing their first upgrade and they aren't just immediately getting a huge beat stick weapon, stick to the plan set up with Ever Vigilant. And then after that, there's a whole lot of other things that are really, really worth your experience, even more so than combat training. Charismas and beat cops, Hallowed Mirror level 3, standing at level 3. There are so many great things in Guardian, even outside of that 20 experience super important shell for optimized decks, that it just takes you a long time to get to the point where you're willing to put combat training into a deck. That's its main weakness, just that it has such stiff competition, and I think that's going to be the case with these level 3s for most investigators. The unfortunate fact is that 3 experience is a big ask, and there are a lot of other really good cards in the game, but I do think combat training could find a home in some Guardians. I don't think combat training is necessarily a bad card, I just think it's outshined by its competition, which is a common criticism you're going to have with 3 experience cards. Coming down to scientific theory, this is very obvious why I don't like this one. It's giving Seekers a book and a fist. Okay, Seekers have more book than God. They don't need the help. They can do this without spending 3 experience, and they don't punch things. I don't play this card because Seekers have better things to do with their experience and time, or cards rather, because it is fast, than play Scientific Theory. However, edge case to Joe Diamond. Joe Diamond really appreciates both of those stats and the Horror Soak. Whereas most Seekers don't care about the Fist at all, aren't playing a flex deck and don't need the book as a consequence, and would much more highly value the health damage. So I think specifically in Joe Diamond, Scientific Theory has a really, really good home. It might be a card just for him, but it's a great card for him. Coming down to Plucky, for survivors, this one's going to give you a head and a book. It's going to be tilted towards sanity damage. Looking at this makes me aware of just how few survivors are investigating with their book score. Survivors have pretty good access to head pumps, and for some survivors, maybe this is the thing that gets you to that +2 against a 3 or 4 difficulty test and would have a lot of merit because of that. But I look at this, I'm like, all right, so you want to spend 3 experience on an asset card that gives you sanity soak and +1 head. You do know about Pete Sylvester, right? You have to care about that book a lot for this to be the right choice to make, or your economy is insanely tight. And again, the tighter your economy is with these cards, the worse they get because you can't use that lightning bolt. And I really don't think there is a survivor that cares about the book that much. Afghan Pete can use it, Stella can use it, Wendy can use it, but Wendy's getting a lot of her clues with foot checks. Stella and Pete are usually either stomping a test because of either Quick Learner or Duke, or just probably not even taking the test if they don't have some other way of pumping it up. If I played this in anyone, I think I would play it in an Ashcan deck, but even then, I don't think I can see this card having a home. I want Plucky to be good. I look at plus book, plus head. That is the best stats in the game. The best defensive stat, the best proactive stat. It costs 0, it's fast, it gives you 2 horror soak. Really, it gives you 1/3 soak, but you don't want to use those last points of soak. And Survivor is the class that has the easiest time burning experience frivolously, because they can make such powerful decks with low experience counts. Patrice might be able to make really good use of this, actually. This could fit into a Patrice deck nicely as well. The problem is that Patrice doesn't need it. She's already doing the same thing with Cornered or all the skills she's drawing. She doesn't need Plucky to accomplish that purpose. But I don't feel like Pete does either, and just... I want Plucky to be good, but I'm looking at it and I'm just having a hard time explaining why anyone would really need this. I feel like if I'm underestimating any of the cards today, it's going to be Plucky. I can imagine a deck where Plucky shines and is incredible, but I'm not seeing it right now. I can't think in my head of a situation where Plucky is like shining in a deck. And 3 experience cards should shine. When you spend 3 experience on a card, you don't want to play it and feel okay about it. You want to play Stand Together and draw your team 4 additional cards and understand why it was in your deck immediately. And this doesn't do that. There's no investigator where it's really that much better than +1 book. Most of the characters that can consider this don't really need the defensive aspect of this. And if all you're getting is +1 book, I'm never putting Guiding Spirit in my deck. And admittedly, it takes up an ally slot. But the point is that there are enough other ways to get book that spending 3 experience doesn't feel like the way to go. Moxie gives defensive stats to rogues. Now, rogues can definitely use this to protect themselves. Generally speaking, rogues suck at head tests, it's a major weakness. This pushes most rogues to 2 or 3, and even non-big money rogues can easily build a surplus economy deck, where you're usually floating like 5 to 10 resources. You can easily play Leo when you can draw them. You can still run a counter-espionage or an intel report with that sort of economy. And those decks can run a Moxie for the defensive head stat, and for the ability to spend it defensively. That doesn't feel great. I will be the first to admit that. There's the specific edge case of well-prepared in Skids, but if you're playing a Skids deck, you don't get to make fun upgrade choices. You have to play for power right now. If you're spending 5 to 10 experience on 1 to 2 copies each of Moxie and well-prepared, your Skids deck is probably actually trolling your team instead of just being a bad choice. I do think defensively it has merit. If I were going to be spending experience for a defensive setup, I'm just looking at this and wondering why I'm not going for well-connected and counter-espionage first. That said, it's not strictly a bad choice. It does let really weird things happen, like a Dark Horse Finn with Moxie could get to 3 base head, and then he's not that far off from getting to something workable with a committed skill. Savant especially would just be an auto pass at that point. So even though I don't see myself playing Moxie that often, it is definitely a card that's on my radar, and just like Scientific Theory, it has a very clear home. +1 foot, +1 head are defensive stats, so Safina already has a 4 in. You play Moxie. If you're playing Moxie and Safina, your defensive stats are so high that she and Wendy Adams are the only characters doing this, that you basically don't care what the Mythos deck says. If it tells you to take a test, you're like, yeah, sure, and you just pull from the chaos bag without even really thinking about it. But in Safina, Moxie's even better than something like Moonstone is in Wendy, because Moxie is going to let her use its ability to spend these resources proactively. It also just uses the base stats proactively, because Safina is all about duplicating events that are using your head and your foot, or using mystic assets that use your head. And Moxie is just so much better in Safina. And just like Joe, Safina values this health soak more than she would value horror soak. I think Moxie is the most playable of them so far, the one that has the largest number of use cases where I would consider it. But I also think that realistically, the only two I'm considering playing as like, this is good and I want to seriously look at this immediately, are Safina with Moxie and Joe Diamond with Scientific Theory. Grounded's the one that makes me the saddest of the bunch. It gives you +1 skills during spell cards. All the spell cards use the same thing. This is literally just one half of Moxie that can't even be used defensively. In its defense, it has the best soak spread in terms of just keeping it alive. But that's not worth very much, because it still requires you to have soak to keep it going anyway. Grounded is just very, very sad. I am surprised it wasn't reworked for the level 3 version in some capacity. There's really not much reason to run this. If you just want +1 skill tests during spells, get the Tarot for 3 more resources, maybe the same resources if you get lucky, but also for 2 less experience. Get Holy Rosary, get Relic Hunter, get whatever other way of getting this head you want. And it gets especially bad later in a campaign, which is when you'll have the experience to afford this, because you've already upgraded your spell assets. You're getting +2 or 3 on them inherently by that point. Grounded just isn't a very good card, and I don't see any relevant use for it, to be honest. So of the Composures, I really think Moxie and Scientific Theory are the only two that have any use case where I would seriously consider them. I think the fact that they cost 3 experience to put in your deck puts them towards the latter half of a campaign when you even start considering them, and for most of them, there just aren't really clear homes for them. But anything that helps rogues defensively is always valuable. So Moxie has a lot of characters considering it, even though it might not be ideal in any of them. However, in specifically Safina, Moxie is just insane. Moxie is so good in Safina, and the exact same thing happens with Scientific Theory and Joe. I think generally the Composures are very niche cards, but when you find a perfect home for that niche like Moxie and Scientific Theory do, I think they might be some of the best cards in that deck. Even if you can't afford to upgrade them early, they'll still be great once you find the experience to get them. Anyways, if I'm missing out on any really effective uses for these cards that just isn't coming to me immediately, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I've been Rather Incoherent. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more content like this in the future, then subscribe, like, comment, etc. Blah, blah, blah. You all know the drill. And I'll see you in the next one.